Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a few seconds so people can join, then we'll start. Okay, I see that there are a few of us still joining, but I think we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Buenos días a todas y todos. Welcome to our webinar. Just to say before I go any further, the next slide, please, that there's live interpretation in English, French, and Spanish, which is available. So please choose your preferred language by clicking on the interpretation icon. So just a short introduction. My name is Rachel Moussier. I'm the Director of Programs at WeGo and have the honor of moderating the webinar today, entitled World Bank, IMF, and Universal Social Protection Following COVID-19, the Good, the Bad, and the Unclear. Next slide, please. So in this webinar, representatives from different different civil society organizations, including unions and workers' organizations, will share their perspectives on whether, and if so, how, international financial institutions have changed their position on social protection in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on recently published evidence, we will discuss what is new regarding the international financial institutions' engagement on social protection, what counts as progress, and what are areas where IFIs may continue to fall short on realizing the right to social protection for all. We're meeting today, a few days after the conclusion of the IMF and World Bank annual meetings last week. As highlighted by the IFIs then, the world is facing multiple and interconnected crises, including increased poverty, food shortages, energy shocks, debt crisis, climate change, inflation, and sadly, war. The urgent need for effective and universal social protection cannot be clearer, and indeed, as discussed in previous socialprotection.org webinars, important strides were taken in some countries during the pandemic to rapidly extend social protection coverage. And during this period, the IMF and the World Bank also paid more attention to social protection. In some IMF loan arrangements, conditionalities include minimum floors on social spending, protecting some health and education expenditure. The World Bank actively participates in USP 2030, co-chairing this with the ILO, and increasingly uses the language of universal social protection. And more recently, its new Social Protection and Jobs Compact emphasizes the need to reach workers in informal employment, the missing middle in social protection policy. Yet many civil society organizations at the annual meetings last week noted the IMF's continued emphasis on inflation targeting and fiscal consolidation to address these mounting crises. And these austerity measures lead to cuts in public spending and social protection, as highlighted in Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummins' latest review of 267 IMF country reports. So the panelists today come from unions and NGOs, and will discuss whether the international financial institutions have really changed. Are their policies supporting or undermining the development of rights-based, inclusive, universal social protection? And what shift in policies are needed for the IFIs to support the realization of the right to universal social protection? So let me introduce them here. Next slide, please. Our first panelist is Lena Simet. Lena is a senior researcher and advocate on poverty and inequality at Human Rights Watch. Her research focuses on social protection, labor rights in non-standard forms of employment, and how austerity-driven budget cuts and the privatization of basic essential services can undermine human rights. Welcome, Lena. It's wonderful to have you with us. Lena will speak to Human Rights Watch's research on targeted social protection programs. We'll then hear from Evelyn Astor. Evelyn is an advisor on economic and social policy at the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, where she works on issues around fair wages, access to social protection, and fiscal space. She serves on the tripartite advisory committee of the ILO's global flagship program for social protection floors and the steering committee of the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection. And again, welcome Evelyn. And Evelyn will be sharing perspectives from the global labor movement on the impact of IFI's policy advice on social protection. Our third speaker is Tavengwa Nhongo. Tavengwa is the executive director of the Africa Platform for Social Protection, which brings together national social protection platforms in over 37 countries in Africa. He's also an advisor of the African Union on Aging, Human Rights, and Social Protection, and a core group member of the Global Coalition of Social Protection Floors. So Tavengwa brings a regional perspective to this discussion and will speak to how IFI's policies are playing out in the African context. Welcome. We then have Daisy Sibun. Daisy is a social policy specialist at Development Pathways. She specializes in the analysis and design of inclusive social protection systems with a particular interest in the political economy of social protection. And Daisy will interrogate the World Bank's progressive universalism approach to social protection, which we've been hearing a lot about. So welcome, Daisy. And our two final panelists include Ghislaine Saizonu-Boum. Ghislaine is the ITUC Africa's program coordinator with responsibility for gender equality and social protection and the social and solidarity economy. She's served the trade union movement, working to promote social protection and gender equality as key pillars of decent work. And from Ghislaine, we'll be able to view the ITUC Africa video on why universal social protection is integral to the continent's progress and resilience. And finally, we will hear from my colleague at WIGO, Florian Jurgens-Grantz. Florian is a social protection specialist at WIGO. He focuses on the design, implementation, and evaluation of social protection policies and programs. Previously, Florian worked on social protection at HelpAge International and the International Labour Organization. So Florian will present new research findings on taxation and informality and the implications for social protection policy. So welcome everybody, and we're very much looking forward to this broad and rich discussion. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to Lena, who will be our first panelist, just to let you know that you can input your questions and comments to the speakers as we go along in the Q&A box. We will have time for some exchanges at the end. And so we'd really appreciate that interaction. So make sure to leave some time for that. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Lena for the first intervention. Lena, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. Before diving into my assessment of the World Bank's approach to social protection and whether it is in line with human rights, let me briefly give you a bit of an overview of social protection as a human right. Next slide, please. So there's several human rights frameworks that uphold that everyone as a member of society has the right to social security. So this fundamental right is very clearly outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It is further supported by international conventions guaranteeing that everyone should have financial security throughout their life and circumstances beyond a person's control that impact their livelihood. So that's, for instance, in the event of unemployment, disability, or old age, or other circumstances. So within human rights frameworks, the right to social security is for everyone, not just for a privileged few, and should not only be used as a last resort for those who are already experiencing poverty, but it is essential to protecting people from experiencing conditions of poverty to begin with, So it should be a precursor rather than a last resort safety net. And although Social Security is a human right, more than half of the world's population still lacks any form of social protection. So there's a very far way to go. And that's where the IFIs, so the international financial institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank, come in and play a huge role in advancing this. During the pandemic, the World Bank tripled their investment in social protection and now has a funding portfolio of more than 29 billion US dollars in 71 countries. So it's a very significant amount in a very significant way in which they can shape programs and advance the social protection agenda. So in the spirit of the title of today's webinar, I'm organizing my reflections on the World Bank's approach around the good, the bad, and the unclear. So the next slide, please. Let's start with the good. Aside from scaling up investment in social protection during the pandemic, the World Bank has also made a strong commitment to universal social protection, especially in the most recent publication around the Social Protection and Jobs Compass that was launched just a few weeks ago, which is very promising and in fact a shift from previous visions of the World Bank. The World Bank now also acknowledges a systems approach to ensuring social protection, as well as a great emphasis on the returns to investing in social protection, which should not be seen as a drain on a government's budget, but rather an investment in a country's future, which is very welcome. The World Bank has also recognized the role that social protection plays in reducing economic inequality. So all of these things are really great aspects that we are celebrating. But on the flip side, please, the next slide, is that although we agree on the what, so we seek to advance universal social protection, we are concerned about the how. So how do we get there? And the World Bank seems to continue to emphasize prioritizing the poorest in their vision as well as their strategy, which in the past has translated to poverty targeting, and sometimes very narrow poverty targeting. So poverty targeting means providing programs exclusively to people below a certain income threshold, which at times is just below the poverty line, but also sometimes just below the extreme poverty line, or is associated with a range of other household characteristics that intend to assess a household's economic situation, which is often referred to as proxy means testing or PMT. The World Bank also continues to fund and stress the role of social registries. And all this is while research by Development Pathways and other organizations have found that these methods contain extremely high error rates, are expensive, and almost always outdated. So while targeting may seem to make intuitive sense, in practice, it fails to reach intended beneficiaries, often by design. In Lebanon, just to give you an example, where more than 80% of the population is currently considered to live in poverty, the two largest social protection programs, both are World Bank financed and co-designed, reach just the poorest 27%. So there's a huge missing middle, or even missing at the bottom. Poverty targeting has a series of other shortfalls, which I have listed in the next slide. Research by Human Rights Watch and others found that narrowly targeted programs are more prone to corruption, they're more expensive to administer, they can stigmatize recipients, and they undermine their ability to foster solidarity within a society. Most importantly, they truly fail to meaningfully reduce poverty and inequality, and therefore fall short in protecting people's rights. I should say that means-tested or targeted programs can play a role in social protection systems, however, only as a secondary function. So the issue is they shouldn't be the very foundation of social protection programs. And in fact, that's what we continue to see in many of the World Bank programs. Finally, it's very discouraging that the World Bank fails to explicitly recognize that social security is a human right. It's not just a smart investment in a country's future, it's also something that people are entitled to. So as my last comment, and I'd like to finish on these points which are unclear, so that's on the next slide. So some aspects that remain unclear for us, which could be interesting to pick up in our discussion, is that there's therefore a lack of clarity in this pathway of moving from poverty targeted programs to truly universal social protection systems that guarantee people the right to social security. It's also unclear to what degree the World Bank is committed to long-term financial commitments towards achieving universal social protection, including in times of recession, austerity, and other economic crises. And finally, while we really welcome the World Bank's call for more collaboration with civil society organizations in this pathway towards universal social protection, it's unclear how this will be done and what mechanisms are put into place to provide meaningful input and shape programs at a day-to-day level. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you for those interventions, and I think you've set the stage for the challenges that we see with targeting programs. So thanks, and I know that will come up again. Evelyn asked. Evelyn, please go ahead.
Thank you, and it's great to follow on from Lena, which I think gives a great overview to many of the concerns that the labor movement also has in terms of the IMF and banks' approaches. I'd like to start off with a bit of context. If you could go to the next slide, please. I would like to start off by a general remark about how trade unions from across the world have rather long-standing concerns on the IMF and banks' excessive focus on cutting social spending, excessive targeting, as outlined by Lena, as well as promoting the privatization of certain forms of social protection, especially when it comes to pensions. And here I'm starting out with a few images that illustrate some cases in point. The first image on the left is that of a demonstration of labor unions and also the general public in Greece following the IMF intervention in Greece, imposing reforms on social protection during the last financial crisis. The IMF took a hardline stance within the Troika or Brussels group, pressuring EU lenders not to make loan disbursements unless Greece cut pensions so that the basic level would be 360 euros a month, so below the minimum subsistence level. My second case is around, if you look on the top right, this is a recent demonstration of labor unions in Argentina, protesting against the IMF's involvement in the country, and particularly conditions made around pensions. Going back in Argentina in the 90s, the IMF successfully pressured the government to privatize its pension system. And this is something that the IMF and the World Bank were doing in a number of other countries as well, Hungary, Poland, Kazakhstan, Bolivia, to name a few, with devastating consequences in terms of access and adequacy, as well as financial sustainability. Argentina since reversed the privatization, but now with the IMF again in the country, continuing to put pressure in terms of expenditures around pensions. And you'll see in the slide here, someone is holding up a placard, "Somos jubilados pero con memoria." We are retired, but with memory. This is certainly an experience that labor unions do not want to see repeated. And the third case has to do is an example of recent trade union mobilizations in Mongolia following pressure from the IFIs to further reduce social spending. a couple of years ago, the World Bank came in with the Asian Development Bank to target Mongolia's universal child benefit. This was a move that was very highly critiqued by a number of international organizations, including UNICEF, because it dramatically reduced the scope of assistance and has been very, very much criticized for the high exclusion errors related to it. Beyond these three examples, I could say that in 2017, there was a review of the IMF's approach to social protection that was published by the fund's independent evaluation office. And it noted that over a 10-year period, on average, 10% of IMF supported arrangements included structural conditionalities to reform or target social spending. It highlighted that the IMF was also often working in tandem with the bank around these policy advices and conditionalities, and that there was an absence of cooperation with the ILO and other UN agencies who support more universal approaches. You can go to the next slide if you like. On that basis, the ITUC and a number of other civil society organizations, as part of the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, wrote to the IMF, critiquing their approach, stressing that the IMF was giving advice and conditionalities to states deviating away from international labor standards and objectives to extend social protection, including those in the SDGs. And this led to a wide-scale review of the IMF's approach to social protection and a big consultation process. What happened? The IMF announced its new strategic framework on social spending. It led to commitments from the IMF around only addressing social protection when the fund deems it macrocritical, to safeguard social spending for the most vulnerable, putting in place social spending floors, enhancing cooperation with other international development institutions. But there's an outstanding question of whether or not this has really led to any meaningful shift in their approach in practice, including since the COVID period. If you look at the recent report from Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings, and austerity, which analyzes the latest 267 IMF country reports, it shows that 120 countries were recently advised by the IMF to target social protection, and 47 countries were advised to reduce also employer social security contributions, meaning hollowing out the financing base for social protections and leading to, let's say, less balanced and progressive financing for social protection. And if you look also in detail at the advice given to specific countries, you can see that the IMF continues to promote cuts to social spending, even for the most vulnerable, which they officially say should be spared from their approach. So if you look at this excerpt from the IMF 2020 country visit to Mongolia, it specifically calls for temporary and targeted support for vulnerable households, but also it is opposed to large hikes in minimum pensions, which are supposed to be basic guarantees for retirement support for people, and also being opposed to hikes in minimum wages, because the IMF suggests that these can be inflationary. Although what we know actually from the COVID pandemic is that the largest drivers of inflation are really around energy and food costs and not actually wage and social protection spending. So this is, of course, deeply problematic and something that we will continue to draw attention to and oppose. If I can shift now to the bank, in my next slide, please. As Lena rightly pointed out, the bank has also recently announced a shift in terms of their approach to social protection. They launched the Social Protection and Jobs Compass just 1 month ago, which is replacing the bank's former social protection and labor strategy, a 10-year strategy that guides the bank's approach internationally to social protection, but also its country level advice. As Lena outlined, there are some positives to the strategy. It affirms the bank's commitment to universal social protection. But as we're going to hear also later from Daisy, their understanding of universal appears to deviate from internationally understood definitions and labor standards, because they're really focused around progressive universalism, helping the poorest and most vulnerable through extending social assistance. And of course, labor unions have long been proponents of extending social protection floors, social security guarantees, irrespective of contributions. However, it seems to pit kind of safety nets or social assistance against broader publicly organized social security, which is deeply problematic from the labor movement, and also puts a very strong emphasis around voluntary and private schemes and opposing employer contributions to social protection as well, something that deviates against Convention 102 on Social Security. I realize that we're short on time, so I would just want to wrap up and say that while the World Bank and the IMF have announced some shifts in terms of their institutional positions around social protection, these shifts have been far from sufficient, according to the international labor movement. There are major deviations that remain between the IMF and banks' positions and international labor standards, in particular Convention 102 on Social Security and Recommendation 202 on social protection floors. And there is a concern that the advice being given will jeopardize the realization of the right to social protection and the achievement of agreed commitments to extend social protection within the SDGs. I leave you with a few links of further reading if you want more information about ITUC's assessments. Also a link to the study from Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings on the IMF's recent country reports, and happy to answer any further questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Evelyn. As we are running short on time, let me just hand over straight away to Dr. Nhongo. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Because perhaps we'll run short of time, let me summarize my presentation into 3 points. The first point is that Africa is increasingly recognizing social protection as a right. And we are seeing that in the various instruments at national level and regional level that are being developed on social protection. So that's the first point. The second point is that there is real growth of the development of social protection programs on the continent. And this is so despite the many challenges that the continent is facing. And this is a growth that we really appreciate. And finally, is the fact that international institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and so on, would rather follow national visions, would rather support the aspirations of the continent in terms of growing the social protection portfolio and not stifle the growth of social protection. So that would be my summary for the presentation which I'm about to give. So if you go back to a couple of slides up, right from there. Just the facts on that slide have already been covered. It's the fact that in Africa, social protection is being increasingly recognized as a right. So I'm not going to spend time on that slide. Next slide, please. Just also emphasizing the fact that in Africa, since the Ouagadougou Declaration of 2004, where the African Union started honing down on the issue of social protection, we have actually seen a lot of progress in terms of the development and implementation of social protection programs. Of course, the programs differ in terms of size, in terms of scope. Some of them are bigger, they are national programs. Others are donor-led, small programs funded by donors, etc. But it is important to note that in nearly every country, out of the 55 countries of the African continent, have one social protection or another. Next slide. And you will notice that since the conference which I was referring to, we are seeing the development of national social protection programs beginning to define social protection increasingly. And we see a lot of governments now defining social protection as a right in their constitutions or in their national laws. But also at the regional level, you are seeing quite a movement towards the development of protocols, such as the protocol on the rights of older persons, protocol on persons with disabilities, and now the protocol on social security and social protection. And so we are seeing an increase in stamping out social protection as a right. COVID-19, which hit us, has really awakened the African continent to the fact that we really need social protection. Next slide, please. But having said that, we know that we are experiencing a few problems as a continent. The instruments which I'm referring to, which talk about rights, are not being ratified or even signed in a number of situations. There is quite a low spending on social protection in many of the countries of the continent. National constitutions that I'm referring to, in some cases can be a hindrance, but we welcome them because they stamp the issue of social protection as a right. So we also see situations where there are international institutions that come on board, the IMF and so on, the World Bank, that come to essentially stop the progress in most of the African countries. I mean, the issue of Lesotho being a good example. The issues of too many donor-led programs stealing away from the fact that countries have to develop their own visions and support their own programs so that these programs are sustainable. So next slide is looking at the issue of prospects, where we are saying that there are a lot of prospects for the development of a very good universal social protection programs across the continent. And I talked about Lesotho, for instance, which went ahead to implement a program on social protection, despite the World Bank advising them against that. And during COVID-19, there were a lot of programs that were introduced, even if they were not regulated in law. But we saw a lot of the countries across the continent implementing programs to push the on the to try in short, international institutions, a humble international institutions, they advise if they support organizations now.
It seems we may have lost Tavengwa. The connection was breaking up for everyone, it seems. Can I suggest that once his connection improves, we can bring him back in and he can say the final words. But I'll hand over to Daisy then on your bit. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks Rachel, and thanks for having me, and it's great to follow some really excellent presentations. I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. So today we're presenting basically just some sort of the touch point core ideas from a new paper that we've just put out about critical analysis of the World Bank's progressive universalism approach to social protection. And the paper funded by ACT Church of Sweden and Action Against Hunger. So the general sort of rationale for the paper was that, as has been mentioned previously by Lena, this is like a very important time in terms of taking stock of progress. There's been very sort of fantastic and encouraging progress in terms of a global consensus being reached around the real urgency and need for universal social protection globally. And it's really fantastic to see so many different sort of diverse actors converge on this USP agenda. And of course, as we've mentioned before, current sort of converging crises are making the need for universal social protection even more urgent. But the sort of point of entry of this paper is that we're sort of looking at how we need to make sure that actors are doing sort of making the most credible effort to work together to realize this quite ambitious goal. And it's important to make sure that different stakeholders are sort of on the same page in terms of the language and concepts and sort of understandings of social protection that we're talking about, and also implementing as well. So I set out to critically analyze narratives around universal social protection to really kind of disentangle the language being used by different influential institutions, namely the World Bank in this case, and see how this really reconciled with internationally accepted instruments and understandings, namely ILO's recommendation 202, and also practices being promoted on the ground. It was based on an in-depth desk-based review of literature and different institutional documents, as well as a series of interviews as well with staff from the World Bank, from the ILO, and also with key shareholders of the World Bank's IDA group, so different constituency governments as well. Or next slide, please, Florian. Thanks. So firstly, it's kind of important to realize that despite this impressive high-level consensus on the USP agenda, which is great and it shouldn't be taken away from, but sort of digging underneath this a bit further, we can see that the approaches taken by the ILO and then the World Bank, on the other hand, continue to diverge. So since 2015, the bank has endorsed USP as a kind of high-level policy priority, and with the formulation of the historic global partnership, USP 2030. But this sort of high-level narrative support of USP is unfortunately weakened by, on the ground, a continued support for a narrow and actually highly inaccurate poverty-targeted approach. And so we've seen progressive universalism as a term that's been coined by the World Bank and used in policy documents since about 2019. And however, it's important to distinguish that it's quite different from the term, although similar, progressive realization. So progressive realization, as we know, I won't go into too much detail, is a cornerstone of the human rights framework. And it's included within ILO's R202, reasoning that countries should build and extend systems gradually over time, and in line with their sort of nationally dependent fiscal constraints that we all know countries do have, but importantly, also respecting other principles as well, including the important principle of the allocation of maximum resources available, and that governments have responsibility to most credibly realize social and economic rights through allocating this maximum resources available. So we see actually the progressive universalism concept being a more sort of specific reinterpretation of this sort of internationally understood definition. So the term is used by the bank to argue specifically for a focus on reaching the poorest and most vulnerable first, but then with a view to kind of eventually arriving and achieving universal social protection coverage further down the line. But importantly, sort of without a clear theory of change or pathway through which these two approaches can be bridged. So this kind of, it sort of stands with quite a disconnect, this focus on poverty targeted approach, which is recommended, and we see that also in practice as well, but with this sort of vision of towards universal social protection. And we see that this is sort of perhaps a way to reconcile these two approaches in practice, then sort of within this USP framework that the World Bank has aligned with since 2015. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so I won't go on this in too much detail because I don't want to take too much time, and I know that this has already been discussed in part as well, and we can talk about it perhaps in the discussion. But essentially, in focusing on poverty targeted approach, progressive universalism, I argue in the paper, is actually promoting, unfortunately, a failed approach, or it's sort of promoting the prioritization of a failed approach. So there's a few reasons why poverty targeting is a failed approach. Again, I won't go through all of these, but firstly, sort of based on the premise of there being the static group of the poor to identify in a context where actually low income is often incredibly widespread, and vulnerability is sort of too dynamic to track from each day. And also relatedly, and as Lena mentioned as well, the inaccuracy of poverty targeting mechanisms, as we see evidence shows that it's kind of actually nearly sort of impossible really to actually do poverty targeting accurately. The strong evidence to suggest that targeting can undermine trust in governments, and especially important at the moment when we see the sort of widespread nature of economic grievances globally, and actually sort of the failure of governments in adequately addressing these, contributing to protests and unrests happening in many countries. And also the importance of focusing on rights as well, how poverty targeting can undermine the rights and dignity of individuals, and really crucially as well, we're looking at sort of bridging this gap in the concept of progressive universalism, of how focus on targeting can sort of later on lead to achieving this broader vision of universal social protection. The political economy of targeting often means that programs can sort of lack the broad-based political support to have those sort of incentives to expand over time, and this is an important point to capture. Next slide, please. So yeah, and just to mention as well.
Daisy, just to say, you have just one more minute left.
Okay, sorry. So we see that poverty targeting is less explicit in the compass, and sort of over time as positioning of the World Bank's approach has gone on, it has become less explicit, but it is still sort of, I would argue, the main strategy, as can be seen in priorities of financing, and also in sort of the reliance on social registries as well. So I think the main point really here is just to say that the World Bank argued that progressive universalism is sort of one route to achieving universal social protection systems, and therefore in line with R2 and 2. And yes, it is great, and it's really good to talk about universal systems rather than just strictly prescribing universal programs. It's sort of broader than this. And it's also true that R202 is open enough that there are a number of ways for countries to get there, as it should be. Diversity of approaches is important, not just tax finance, but contributory approaches and sort of the intersection between these as well. Yet sort of in reality, unfortunately, the progressive universalism approach as it stands now promotes an exclusive focus on targeting, which does not sort of provide the core building blocks to effectively build a universal social protection floor. It's sort of endorsing this approach as the primary means of designing a system, rather than actually what it could be, which is a small complement to larger core life cycle programs that can more credibly provide this and build this kind of floor progressively. It's sort of about the relative emphasis, I think. It's poverty targeted schemes can play a small part within universal systems, but they're just ineffective as the primary means of affecting of building these floors. And I think it also kind of precludes us from thinking more creatively and more ambitiously about other possibilities available for low and middle income countries in building these floors. Next slide, please. I won't go into this too quickly, but the sort of concrete consequences of this focus on sort of singularly recommending targeting, it does have consequences in terms of policy direction and policy choice for countries as well. So just for example, often, unfortunately, the poverty targeting can be promoted at the expense of supporting governments to introduce or strengthen flagship life cycle programs. For example, the World Bank and the IMF has recommended targeting a number of universal pensions, Nepal, Thailand, Kenya, Mauritius, Namibia, and also a number of universal child benefits, as well as Evelyn also mentioned in the case of Mongolia. Sorry, next slide, please. And just very quickly, not only is sort of a core point I can't not mention in this presentation, not only is progressive universalism sort of, I'd argue in the paper, sort of recommending promoting a sort of primary focus on poverty targeting that's ineffective at sort of realizing the end, the universal social protection coverage and the flaws that the R202 seeks to build. But also it's sort of not consistent with the means by which countries get there as well. So it's also inconsistent with a rights-based approach. So with R202, there's a lot of sort of teeth to the document. It's very great in sort of how it really explicitly embeds core rights-based principles. And so I'd argue that a focus on poverty targeting might not be consistent with this, and we might think about other ways to sort of broaden our understanding. And a final slide, sorry, very, very quickly. So why does this all matter? Surely if everyone is on board in this and we're moving forward and with a great consensus, that's, you know, we shouldn't be picky about the language use. We should just keep going. And yes, absolutely, we should be really positive about so much progress and continual progress that is happening. But I think it's just important to sort of slow down and take stock at some point and just realize that sort of language matters. It's sort of valuable to maintain the kind of conceptual clarity around the sort of different approaches and the merits of the different approaches to social protection that are available to policymakers, to remain clear on the differences between them. And I think there often needs to be sort of more awareness among actors and even among shareholders of the banks of the kind of approach that is being pushed by the bank, even if it's the language is changing. We need to just be clear on sort of taking stock of actually on the ground the sorts of policies that are still being promoted. And I think there's also a danger of sort of creating a false equivalence between these two approaches. And in the paper, I look at sort of ever different concepts as well as progressive universalism that might risk confusing the differences between these approaches. And actually that might sort of risk losing the clarity on the evidence around the benefits of the different approaches and the principles at the heart of the USP agenda, which is important to keep clear sight of. So anyway.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Daisy. And thank you for reminding us of the centrality of language and the clarity that is needed to understand the way in which language is used to convey different concepts and different approaches to social protection. I'm going to now come back to Tavengwa, who was on his last slide and before his connection dropped. Tavengwa, would you be able to just give just a closing statement in terms of what was shared? Perhaps the connection is not working.
Yes, I am back.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Well, yes, I was in my last slide, I was just emphasizing international institutions and are very important.
Sorry, Tavengwa, the connection's not very strong. Sorry about that. It doesn't seem like we can hear you. But if you'd like, we'll hopefully the connection will improve for the question and answer part, and you'll have a chance to come in then. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Ghislaine. Bonjour Ghislaine, si je comprends bien votre intervention.
Merci beaucoup.
Bonjour.
Nous sommes
Si je comprends bien, votre intervention sera en français?
Exactement, je vais essayer d'aller en français pour changer un peu.
Donc,
nous sommes totalement en phase avec tous les arguments qui ont été présentés par mes prédécesseurs pour mettre en exergue l'inefficacité de la méthode et puis de l'approche de la Banque mondiale et des institutions de financement aujourd'hui dans notre approche de voir la protection sociale universelle et pour tous. Avec la crise de la COVID-19, nous avons pu montrer qu'il y a de graves répercussions sur les travailleurs et travailleuses de la région en Afrique. Et grâce à la COVID-19, nous avons vu les limites des politiques de nos gouvernements dans le domaine de la protection sociale, particulièrement envers donc les acteurs, les travailleurs du monde rural et de l'économie informelle. Nous avons tous assisté à cette catastrophe où les États n'avaient même pas de solution en état de choc, ils n'avaient pas de réponse. Et il a fallu que ce soit les institutions et d'autres organisations qui apportent ces réponses-là et que ces États-là s'endettent pour pouvoir rentrer dans l'urgence de répondre à la question de la crise. Et donc, en Afrique, nous avons, et nous le savons depuis, que les acteurs de l'économie informelle contribuent au moins entre 40 et à 45% des produits intérieurs bruts et emploient plus de jeunes et des femmes. Alors, avec Wigo, nous avons fait une recherche conjointe et nous avons vu que la crise a particulièrement touché les travailleurs de l'économie informelle, les jeunes travailleurs, les migrants et migrantes et les femmes, dont la majorité déjà, avant cette crise-là, ne bénéficiait pas de la protection sociale, surtout une des branches importantes, c'est la pension et l'accès aux soins de santé. Et dans le même temps, les droits fondamentaux de ces travailleurs et travailleuses ont été menacés. Il y a eu des fermetures anarchiques, il y a eu des licenciements anarchiques, il y a eu le corollaire de tout le mécanisme de travail à distance qui a donc entraîné des conséquences vraiment très néfastes sur les populations. Et la reprise est lente. Et aujourd'hui, nous sommes en train de payer, les États africains sont en train de payer le prix des mesures qui ont été prises au moment de la crise. Et c'est surtout les acteurs de l'économie informelle et du monde rural qui sauvent le prix. Et aujourd'hui, cette reprise-là, elle nous met des mesures d'austérité drastiques en face, et ces mesures d'austérité creusent encore plus les inégalités et la discrimination, qui sont les conséquences donc des conditions qui sont posées par des institutions financières comme la Banque mondiale et les autres institutions à nos États africains. Alors nous disons, il est plus que jamais temps pour nous d'avoir des programmes qui visent à améliorer la protection sociale des travailleurs dans toute la région. Et c'est pour nous faire entendre, faire entendre notre message dans un langage clair, simple, que nous sommes engagés pour une mobilisation totale et un financement équitable de la protection sociale pour tous. Et avec Wigo, nous avons choisi ce canal de la vidéo, du média, qui est accessible à tous, parce que partout maintenant, dans nos villages, dans nos villes, dans nos contrées, tout le monde peut accéder à une vidéo. Tout le monde est branché sur les réseaux sociaux. Et donc, nous, les acteurs du monde du travail, acteurs de l'économie informelle, du monde rural, nous contribuons déjà efficacement à l'économie de nos pays. Nous avons des droits. Nous avons le droit d'accéder à la protection sociale entièrement. Voilà pourquoi cette vidéo a une importance pour nous et nous souhaitons vraiment la partager avec vous, et souhaitons que vous la partagez, vous la diffusez autant que possible dans vos réseaux sociaux et engagez ceux à qui vous les divulguez, partagez, également le partager aussi largement que possible. Voilà rapidement ce que je voudrais partager avec vous pour vous dire, nous avons des droits, nous avons le droit d'accéder à la protection sociale entièrement, nous pouvons mobiliser les ressources, il est temps que les institutions financières adoptent le langage de la protection sociale et accompagnent nos États parce que c'est déjà démontré que dans les exercices macroéconomiques, la protection sociale peut être productive. Voilà.
Merci, Ghislaine.
Building forward better, investing in Africa's workers. We have all witnessed the ways in which COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated existing vulnerabilities. Here in sub-Saharan Africa, 89% of workers are informally employed. That's 380 million people who had little to no safety net to shield them from the health and economic crisis of COVID. Many rely on their daily income to provide for themselves and their families. Few are covered under existing government social protection programs such as unemployment insurance, maternity benefits, childcare services, and pensions. For these workers, COVID meant having their livelihoods locked down, while also being largely locked out of relief measures. For women, school and creche closures meant a loss of work, both for the women who work in these sectors, as well as for the other working women who depend on their care services. In many ways, the pandemic has shown us who and what is essential and how to build forward better. It showed us that many of the workers we rely on are often excluded from recognition and protection. It also showed us that expanding social protection is possible with political will and works best when a robust social protection system is already in place. Togo and Namibia introduced temporary cash transfers during 2020 for workers in the informal economy to support them through the COVID-19 crisis. At the same time, Kenya and South Africa reached many informal workers through top-ups to old age pensions and child support grants. The pandemic also showed us how organizations of informal workers and trade unions were essential partners in working towards closing this protection gap. In 2020, the Malawi Congress of Trade Unions, the Malawi Union for the Informal Sector, together with ordinary informal traders, challenged the government's failure to provide relief to workers, including informal traders, who were unable to work under the proposed lockdown. The pandemic showed us that tax justice makes good economic sense, while balancing budgets on the backs of the poor does not. Many African countries finance social protection, such as cash and food support, via indirect taxes such as VAT, which can leave poorer people and women paying a higher share of their income in taxes. Informal workers often pay too much of their income to taxation, tolls, licenses and fees, while also having to pay bribes in order to receive basic services and being harassed for simply trying to earn a living. Meanwhile, corruption and tax evasion sees an estimated $89 billion leave the continent every year. It's time to crack down on those depleting the economy and invest in the people who keep our world running. Research shows that a bottom-up economic stimulus is one of the most cost-effective responses to this crisis. The sheer size of the informal workforce means that small investments can have a big impact on stabilizing incomes and families and kickstarting recovery. Cash and in-kind transfers go further when quality, affordable and accessible public services exist to meet the healthcare and childcare needs of all workers. For the poorest countries, domestic efforts to rebuild require international solidarity, including genuine payment of 0.7% of the GDP of OECD states to developing economies, as well as supporting the creation of a global social protection fund. Government, industry, and all workers have an essential role to play in scaling up social protection and public services and creating a decent world of work. In fact, collaborative blueprints already exist. Recommendations 202 and 204 of the International Labour Organization, Sustainable Development Goals 1, 3, and 8, can be drawn on to start planning a just recovery and a resilient future, one that leaves no one behind. Social protection for all workers is possible. Building forward.
Merci beaucoup. Voilà, le message, il est clair et cette vidéo est assez explicite et prend en compte tout ce qui a été dit par mes prédécesseurs.
Merci beaucoup Ghislaine et merci surtout pour cette collaboration et cette belle vidéo faite ensemble.
Je voudrais juste ajouter que l'Union africaine vient également donc de mettre en exergue le protocole sur la protection sociale et la sécurité sociale qui vient conforter donc notre position de l'universalité de la protection sociale pour tous.
Absolument, comme l'avait mentionné aussi Tavengwa. Merci.
Exactement.
Okay, over to Florian now for the last intervention. Florian, please take it away.
Thank you very much. And hi, everybody. I'm really excited to speak as the final speaker here. I want to pick up the point from the video that says, balancing the budgets on the backs of the poor workers is unjust and not a way to ensure an inclusive, sustainable economic recovery from COVID. And I want to talk about how IFIs, World Bank, and the IMF are presenting, taxation in the informal economy. You see here a couple of quotes from very recent, this year and last year, high-level, high-profile publications from the IMF and the World Bank. And, they paint a very, very dark picture. Informal workers, they're in the shadow economy. They try to remain undetected. They act informality as cheating to avoid taxes. They evade their obligations to the state by not paying taxes. Tax evasion is the core of informality. So, pretty consistent and pretty negative language around, 2 billion workers globally, very much portraying them as, essentially tax avoiders, not very far away from kind of criminals in that sense. But the reality, and this is what I want to share with you, that's just not the case. And we know from plenty of studies that informal workers actually pay a significant share of their incomes in taxes. WIGO has recently conducted a large representative survey of informal workers in Accra, Ghana. And we looked at, okay, well, do they actually pay any taxes? We were told from the IMF that they're avoiding these taxes and their obligations to the state. But it turns out the vast majority, close to 70%, they pay some kind of tax, a tax, a fee, a license, or different kind of payments to different public entities. I think one of the reasons why we might not consider them as taxes, because a lot of those go to kind of municipal government entities. But if you add those up, we're talking about a very significant tax burden that informal workers are paying, and thereby contributing to state coffers and the financing of social protection and services. What is also important to note is those payments can be quite regressive, and we see here, the proportion of taxes, fees, and payments as a share of income by quintile. First quintile being the poorest, fifth quintile being the better off informal workers. And amongst the poorest informal workers, on average, 9% of their gross earnings are paid in various types of taxes. And there's huge variation. Some pay up to half of their earnings. But the fact is, taxes are being paid. Very high shares of taxes relative to poor workers' incomes are being paid amongst the poorer segments of the informal economy. Amongst women in the lowest quintile, they pay 7 times more than better off informal workers. So it's a hugely regressive tax system that informal workers have to face. And I think one of the challenges of this rhetoric that we get from the World Bank and the IMF around informal workers being untaxed or representing a gold mine of domestic resource mobilization, that they're untapped and they provide the answer for financing social protection, but also kind of post-COVID economic recovery, is that this perception that informal workers don't pay any taxes, that can lead to some that makes them quite exposed to potential post-COVID efforts to increase tax revenues. So for instance, again, going back to our study, which we'll hope to publish very soon, and there's some initial briefs that we've already put out on this, Ghana has introduced a 1.5% tax on mobile money transactions. So there's any time you use any kind of mobile money service, 0.5% of that goes to essentially, is a tax. And this is explicitly framed by the enormous potential of tax revenue from the informal economy. Again, they're portrayed as not paying any, so, it makes sense. But again, this is a highly regressive tax we find with the poorest informal workers paying much more than the better off informal workers. For the poorest, we're talking about 8 to 6% men and women in the lowest quintile paying this kind of levy. This is obviously in addition to other forms of taxation. So I think here we see how the lack of understanding of the contributions that informal workers actually make can lead to policy advice that is regressive and that I think holds the potential of undermining an inclusive recovery. If we keep piling these taxes on people who are barely surviving and who've lost tremendous amount of income during COVID, that's a recipe for disaster, I think. And all the while taxes are being paid, informal workers, as we know, from many places, receive very little social protection. So again, going back to Ghana and this large representative sample of informal workers in Accra, less than 1% received any of the government cash transfers. This could be the LEAP program that many of you might know, or the Nkoso cash transfer. These are targeted at the extreme poor. Informal workers tend to be maybe a little bit better off. They're still poor in many ways, but maybe not destitute, and have labor capacity. So they're excluded from those. At the same time, very interestingly, they were excluded from government's kind of, let's say, small business, micro business relief programs. It's the CAP bus. We know that a fair amount of informal workers, 15%, applied, but most unsuccessfully. So we see here that they fall through the cracks in a way of the social protection system that focused on a very much a narrow kind of targeted safety net. And we've heard a lot about this in previous presentation, while at the same time not being included in the more mainstream business support. And I think that's if we're hoping there's going to be kind of an inclusive economic recovery, and recognizing, as the video said, the sheer size of the informal economy, I think we need to do something about this. So it's encouraging to see that the new social protection strategy of the World Bank is quite strongly focused on informality. It is, I think, it's been said many times now, kind of the missing middle of social policy. That's where the biggest questions are. That's where the biggest gaps are in coverage. So seeing the World Bank strategy explicitly acknowledge that and really, pay a lot of attention to how informal workers can be covered with social protection, I think is very important. I think the real interesting question now is what is that social protection support going to look like? Will they be included but unprotected? We've heard, I think, Evelyn and others talk about the World Bank social protection strategy, very dismissive of public social insurance, very pessimistic in a sense that this can be expanded to informal workers. And I think there's some debate, but it seems that the maybe somewhat higher levels of generosity around social assistance, so this is tax finance, social protection, is still operationalized and framed very much of a safety net. And in the World Bank social protection strategy, there's a lot of talk about access to social assistance if shocks occur, facilitated through dynamic inclusion in a database, but not a real, I would, as I say it, an investment in kind of the working poor, but rather a continuation of a safety net policy. And the main novel idea that is being presented, I think, by the World Bank to provide coverage to informal workers are essentially voluntary savings schemes. And savings are really important. I think they can be an important part of the puzzle. But I think I think others have some questions whether a strategy of expansion that mainly goes through voluntary individual saving schemes can provide the poverty reduction, the risk pooling, the insurance, the redistribution that some of the poorest workers, who have lost a lot of income during COVID, as we've seen, haven't received a lot of social protection report, are on the other hand paying a significant amount in taxes, whether leaving them alone in that sense and asking them to save for their own entirely by themselves without, let's say, contributions from capital or from the government, whether that's a recipe for the kind of social protection they deserve. And I think more broadly, whether that represents an underinvestment in informal workers that together with the relatively significant tax rate is going to hold back a huge portion of the world's working population and hinder them from making the contributions to growth and development that we know or we think they can make. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. And thanks to all the presenters for such thoughtful and detailed presentations, all sort of overlapping, but bringing in something different, something new to the discussion. We have a few questions in the Q&A. Let me take the first question in French for our Francophone speakers, and it is open to any of the panelists. So please just let me know if you'd like to respond. So this is a question from Mr. Abel Carnot. I'll read it out in French. En ce qui concerne la protection sociale, beaucoup de pays en Afrique n'ont pas encore ratifié la Convention 102 et sa recommandation. Est-ce que la Banque mondiale ne peut pas user de son pouvoir pour exiger la ratification de cette convention avant d'investir dans les pays? Evelyn, I see you shaking your head. Would you like to respond?
J'aimerais d'abord dire bonjour à Monsieur Carnot, mon camarade de Côte d'Ivoire, a very distinguished trade union leader and big ally in the movement for extending social protection internationally. I would say perhaps with regards to that, of course, this is something that trade unions have been strongly advocating for IFIs to promote approaches in line with international labor standards. And in an ideal world, I would love to see the World Bank promoting the ratification of Convention 102, which is a very important convention recently reaffirmed by governments, trade unions, and employers as still being relevant, and which should be further promoted during the International Labor Conference last year. The reality is that the bank's approach towards contribution-based social security is very, very much opposed to the provisions of Convention 102. If you look at the social protection and jobs compass, it's very critical around contribution-based social security, which they suggest is regressive because of the fact that often informal workers are left out. That being said, I think there's been a lot of discussion in this meeting today about how it is possible to integrate informal workers into contribution-based schemes and to render them more inclusive. They also, because of their wider scope, they tend to take also a larger, let's say, they have a larger financing base than social assistance. But again, these are, in our view, workers' delayed wages in a way. So we shouldn't be looking at it as just sort of deadweight expenditure, because this is actually money that employers and workers put in very often over the course of their lives to finance. So we have issues with the way that the bank is approaching contributory social security. We would very, very much advocate for the bank to align their approach to the approach of the ILO, which governments and social partners strongly subscribe to. But for the moment, unfortunately, I don't see it happening. We continue to push. And I think the purpose of the meeting today also is to raise these inconsistencies. I remain rather pessimistic on the basis of the compass, which was recently published.
Thanks, Evelyn, and thanks for just providing that background as well. Just one question that was perhaps a clarification question, which came up in the chat. Florian, how do informal workers pay tax if they're not formally registered? Could you maybe just explain that a bit?
I can try, although I'm not an expert on taxation. But I think the important point to make is that there is such a variety of different kinds of payment. So there's certain fees that workers pay when accessing markets where they say they're selling their goods. There are maybe associated with those, there's certain fees to access kind of utilities that, water, sanitation that come with it. There's also some systems where, where there's kind of like flat taxes and presumptive fee taxes, where there's a kind of a general, like a flat tax applied to workers where there isn't an assessment made of how much they earn. I think then there's a variety of license fees that are operating. I think again, this isn't my area of expertise, but I think the big point is that lots of those taxes and fees are paid not necessarily to the national government, but they're paid to different levels of kind of administration. So often it's municipal bodies that receive those taxes, and they know where, I guess, where informal workers are. They know where the markets are, and they have them in some of the systems. Sorry, I hope that makes sense. We can share you some more information on that. I don't quite know the details of how it works, but the fact is they do seem to be paying a fair amount of different kinds of payments that all add up in the end. And yeah.
Thanks, Florian. And we're seeing some confirmation of that point from Victor in the chat as well. So, Ghislaine, vous avez un point à ajouter au débat? Ghislaine?
Oui, je voudrais répondre à deux questions à la fois, à celle concernant donc la Convention 102, mais également celle qui concerne aussi la fiscalisation, avec des exemples concrets. En ce qui concerne la 102, avec notre petite expérience du mouvement syndical en Afrique, on pense vraiment que c'est une question de volonté. Quand la volonté y est, les États ratifient. Nous avons vu des petits pays qui n'ont pas les grands moyens, qui ont quand même ratifié cette Convention 102. Donc, c'est vraiment une question de volonté politique et les arguments qui sont avancés pour montrer qu'il n'y a pas concordance entre l'universalité et les possibilités des États, l'universalisme de la protection les moyens des États, en fait, c'est un jeu de mots et une absence de volonté. Parce que la protection sociale en Angleterre, à un moment donné, on a dit un paquet minimum pour tous. Et cela a fonctionné parce qu'il y a une volonté politique. Et c'est ça qui devait se faire. Si la Banque mondiale a vraiment compris le fond de ce que nous appelons protection sociale pour tous et son universalité, avec un diktat, on va le dire comme ça, parce que ce ne sera pas de la démocratisation par rapport à la protection sociale, mais cela doit se faire avec vraiment une imposition et dire c'est ça ou c'est rien, parce qu'il est démontré que la protection sociale est vraiment le moteur du développement et c'est inclusif. Par rapport à la taxation, la fiscalisation et les impôts, c'est également une volonté politique et une organisation au niveau de la décentralisation. Nous avons vu au niveau des acteurs de l'économie informelle qui sont structurés, organisés, volontaires pour contribuer. C'est ça qu'il faut tenir comme élément important. Et avec cette volonté, ils accompagnent la structuration au niveau des États pour payer. Et à partir du moment où nous payons, nous sommes en mesure, les taxes que l'État nous impose, nous sommes en mesure d'attendre un minimum de services de nos États. Et c'est ce minimum de services, dans ce minimum de services, n'est pas inclus l'accès à la protection sociale. Et voilà le grand problème, le grand challenge, et surtout en Afrique. C'est pour cela que je dis, il y a des exemples. Au Togo, nous avons vu des acteurs de l'économie informelle s'allier à la municipalité pour collecter des taxes, les reverser avec un pourcentage pour avancer. Mais en retour, le système de protection sociale imposé est contributif pour ces acteurs de l'économie informelle. Et ce n'est même pas bien organisé. Donc, il y a une absence de volonté, mais également donc, de mesures proactives et des mesures qui sont endogènes, qu'on refuse de voir. Et pourtant, il y a beaucoup de recherches qui proposent ces mesures-là à ces gouvernements. Voilà un peu ce que je voudrais ajouter et par rapport donc, à la réponse de Florian et aussi celle d'Evelyn.
Merci beaucoup, Ghislaine, pour cette réalité de ce qui se passe vraiment avec des travailleurs informels en Afrique. Je pense que c'est important de noter ce vécu, en fait, et ne pas juste se fier à ce qui est écrit dans les rapports et l'avis qui est des fois donné aux au gouvernement sans cette perspective de l'économie informelle et des travailleurs du secteur formel et informel. I would like to take one, Lena, I was going to call on you anyway to answer a question. Would you like to take the floor? Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to respond to some questions that came up around fiscal space, and are we just idealists, reaching for the sky without being mindful of realities on the ground? And I would like to push back here a bit, because there are, I think also some of the cases were presented today, there are a number of countries, often very low income countries, that managed to introduce more universal systems. And one case that I should mention is Nepal, a very low income country that in '94 introduced a social pension, a universal social pension, which remains in place until today. Although there remain some concerns around bringing it fully in line with human rights obligations, it nevertheless is universally accessible, and everyone has the right to financial security at old age. So here, this country, without relying a whole lot on financial contributions from IFIs, such as the bank, they managed to introduce a more universal program. So again, there are ways to finance it, to collect more domestic revenues, to push ahead. And I think, as Cohen also responded really well in the chat, there's also currently pushes towards a global fund for social protection that would provide low-income countries with the fiscal resources needed to kickstart more universal programs, and then over time make them run through domestic resources. And again, those should be financed not through consumption taxes such as the VAT, because we've seen what this means for informal workers or other low-income workers. However, through more progressive income taxes, a wealth tax, or other means that are more inequality reducing. So again, I think we need to be mindful by just throwing around, well, there's no fiscal space, there's austerity and the like, but rather also be mindful of the huge positive effects that universal social protection systems have. We've seen that during the COVID pandemic, and how it also helps countries recover more quickly from disasters and protect people from losing their livelihoods, being evicted, experiencing hunger, and therefore for being really critical, not only to protecting people's rights in the immediate, but also in the long run, and therefore make for more inclusive recoveries.
Thank you, Lena. And I'm really struck by your intervention. It just makes me think back to Evelyn's slide of the photos of the mass mobilizations against the IMF programs, and over the past decade, from Greece to Argentina, and more recently to Mongolia, and just the way in which it's different crises, but different moments of economic crisis, but the same medicine is applied, and the intensifying and sort of interconnectedness of those crises, where can we try something new? Is it time to try something new, a systemic change to address the problems that we're facing today? So Daisy, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to build on some of the points that Lena made as well, in agreement with her. I think this question of fiscal space is a really, really important question to be tackled. I think this is important that we have these kind of discussions. This is exactly why, because I mean, when you look at the idea of progressive universalism and the sort of rationale for focusing on the poorest and most deserving, of course, it kind of seems initially intuitive, right? We have limited resources. Let's focus on giving those to those who are the most in need. But I think it's important to kind of recognize that the sort of approach that we take can also really impact kind of there's also wider implications for that. We can have the kind of economic benefits of a more transformational, inclusive approach that can actually sort of increase the size of the pie, which can then be reinvested into people. And I think there's sort of different approaches, and the sort of, I touched on before, the sort of political economy aspects of different approaches that can be pursued are really important in terms of keeping a kind of longer term vision in terms of national budgets, rather than just necessarily beginning and ending the conversation with, you know, there is no fiscal space. That kind of precludes more kind of creative discussions around domestic resource mobilization. I mean, of course, we know countries have fiscal constraints. This is like very evident, especially at the moment, and it's important to design systems that kind of fit realistically within individual countries' budgetary capabilities. I mean, this is why we have the human rights principle of progressive realization, right? We sort of realize that we can't deliver full systems overnight. But I think, again, fundamentally, it's about which approaches can sort of bring about the commitment to fully apply the principle of maximum available resources when pursuing this progressive realization. So I think fundamentally this poverty targeted approach doesn't necessarily encourage these kind of discussions around policymakers about the sort of crucial questions of resource mobilization, and it doesn't really garner the political will again to do this. In practice, by rigidly defining the problem as sort of there's no money at all, this is a tiny little pie that we have, how are we going to distribute it? It results inevitably in small schemes that exclude those on middle incomes who really need that support and who are an important part of a political base, and that they're ineffective as well, even at reaching the poor. And we can see that they may often die out over time or fail to expand due to that lack of political and popular support. And looking at sort of, we should be looking at sort of other possibilities. So we've seen that research from Isabel Ortiz looked at options to expand social investments in about 190 different countries, and found there was capacity pretty much nationally in all of them to finance at least some increased investment in social protection, even in the poorest countries. We've seen governments around the world been applying a wide variety of revenue mobilization choices for decades. We just don't often highlight these success stories. So for example, Bolivia and Mongolia financing universal life cycle benefits from taxes on mining and gas. And also, as Lena mentioned, the example of Nepal has had a very, very long commitment to universal programs, is incrementally building a universal system of universal pension, disability benefits, and now incrementally rolling out a universal child benefit. There's this strong, again, political will there, and this commitment to a universal approach has been incredibly popular, and is clearly having a trajectory of realizing that floor over time. And of course, as well, when we see that we can look at different ways to grow universal social protection systems over time, gradually, and sort of in line with increases in economic growth, but using the principle of universality at the core. So making sure they're not means tested, essentially. And new research that we have coming out as development pathways in Church of Sweden and Action Against Hunger we'll be showing that in a paper coming out soon, looking at different options for financing that can become much more achievable when you sort of progressively roll out schemes over time. I mean, overall, I think each country is unique, and financing options should be sort of carefully analysed for that context. There's no one size fits all, but I think we can kind of do better in terms of thinking more creatively and not just beginning and end with the problem that there is just no fiscal space.
Thank you, Daisy. And just for the anecdote, I am from and based in Mauritius, and so in the past 2 years, we have seen the bank come and challenge our universal pension scheme, and on numerous occasions. And the political will from government to support that is staunch, because partly for re-election reasons, of course, but also because it has been a huge stabilizer in terms of preventing just entire households falling into poverty during the pandemic and the slow economic recovery. So it has been critical to our economic recovery today, and the government will not let go. So I think this also speaks to the question of political will, which was asked in the chat. I am aware that we have come to the end of our time together, and I just want to thank all of the presenters for such valuable contributions, for all of the research that has backed these contributions, and for your engagements with workers and with civil society organizations and policymakers to advance such important and alternative ways of imagining social protection and the financing strategies that go behind that. So a warm thanks to all of you involved and to socialprotection.org for hosting us so effectively as always. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde et à tous les participants. Bonne soirée. Pour moi, c'est le soir. Bonne soirée à toutes et à tous. Thank you, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank
Merci, à bientôt.
Merci, au revoir.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bientôt.